piece of music. It's a piece of film music. It was written by David Raksin and it's called Laura. David Raksin was a composer, mainly of Hollywood film music. He scored over 200 motion pictures. And if he's remembered at all, at least by name, it's because of Laura. Laura is the face in the misty light. Well, I'll come back to how that song came to be composed. A song that both Irving Berlin and Cole Porter said was the one song that they wished that they had written. Eventually that song gained lyrics by Johnny Mercer, but it was just one of many, many film themes that were composed by David Raksin. David was born in Philadelphia. He was musically precocious. He was educated at the Curtis School of Music in Philly. And he was classically educated, but he eventually decided he wanted to come to New York and get involved in popular music. He was on Broadway, orchestrating for many Broadway musicals. He was so talented, and he was an innovator in that period of Broadway when a lot of things were changing. This was the 1930s. It was the Depression era, and songwriters were trying to find ways to stretch the envelope, for want of a better term. It's a time when music and lyrics were becoming much more sophisticated. The books and plots of the Broadway shows were still in many cases rudimentary. And so it was up to the musical minds to find ways to unify these shows. George Gershwin talked about how he would repeat certain notes in different songs that he wrote for a single score, certain sequences, musical sequences, in order to create a sort of subconscious or subliminal sense of cohesion, because there was so little else in these shows that had a sense of cohesion, at least plot-wise or book-wise. So David was in his early 1920s, there in the midst of this amazing explosion of Broadway talent, working with Richard Rodgers and with Vernon Duke and with Jerome Kern, with Mr. Irving Berlin, whom he said was the only songwriter of all those with whom he worked, with whom he didn't really get along. Even though he did have problems with Richard Rodgers, Richard Rodgers was very upset when David had made a mistake in orchestrating part of On Your Toes. He inadvertently put a note in the orchestration that was a mistake. And when Richard Rodgers heard this note at the read-through, he said, "What have you done to my music?" Getting very angry, and it was just a simple mistake. So David, not taking guff from anyone, said, "What music?" And he was immediately fired from On Your Toes. But it was in that same period that he got a call from his friend Edward Powell to come to Hollywood. You see, Eddie Powell was another guy who was working on Broadway very successfully. He orchestrated the Gershwin show Let 'Em Eat Cake, which was the sequel to Of Thee I Sing, and he was very much in demand. But Alfred Newman, who went to Hollywood from Broadway, called for Eddie to come and join him to do orchestrations for his film scoring work. And Alfred Newman became one of those people that invented modern film scoring. So this call comes from Eddie Powell to David Raksin saying, "Can you get out here to Hollywood? Because I've got a job for you that you're going to like, you're going to want." And so David came to Hollywood. Now, the job was to orchestrate and to notate the score for Charlie Chaplin of a film that was in production called Modern Times. Alfred Newman was the musical director, and Charlie Chaplin was composing the score for the film himself. Charlie Chaplin was one of the most extraordinary creators of motion pictures in cinema history. He was the star, the writer, the director, the producer, the composer. He was a guy who had this extraordinary vision for film that has never been equaled. And by the 1930s, he had gone from being a baggy pants silent film comedian to creating a character called The Little Tramp and becoming iconic. And so Chaplin was so powerful and so rich that he called all of the shots. He took several years making Modern Times because with all of his films, he had the luxury of taking as long as he wanted, spending as much money as he wanted. None of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the finished product, whenever it would be done. And nobody knew except when Chaplin said, "It's done." So as time progressed, he made fewer and fewer films through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But Modern Times is considered by many to be the best of all of his feature films, even though David Raksin told me that City Lights was his personal favorite, one released in 1935 years earlier. Now, Chaplin, even though he worked well into the sound era, made Modern Times as essentially a silent film. His character never spoke in the movie, nor did the other characters, because he preferred the medium of the music telling the story along with the action. So David comes to Hollywood and he meets Chaplin. They hit it off, and he becomes, along with Eddie Powell, one of the two people transcribing the Chaplin score. Now, Chaplin whistled. He would whistle the score, and it was up to David and to Eddie Powell to take that whistling and turn it into something that resembled full harmonization, a full piece of music. Now, David said that Chaplin had great musical instincts. He had zero education or ability, so it was hard for him to articulate musically what he wanted, but he could demonstrate through mime and through explanation, and sometimes hitting little things on the piano sort of haphazardly. He could communicate what he wanted. Or David would say, well, how about this chord, or how about this chord, or how about this chord, and that thing. And eventually they would get to what Chaplin wanted. But years and years after that, David did say to me confidentially, because he didn't want to say it publicly, that he did co-compose part of the score of Modern Times because Chaplin did not have the ability to realize everything that he felt inside. And he was not denigrating Chaplin, which is why he never publicly made a statement that I composed part of that. That wasn't his desire, because he revered Chaplin. So one of the pieces of music that Chaplin wrote as underscore for Modern Times went. Then it goes on in a form that may not be familiar to you. If you did recognize that theme, you'll know it in this version. Smile though your heart is breaking, smile even though it's aching. Well, that was a lyric that was added to that tune 15 years or so after it was composed. Parsons, and I forget the name of the other guy, I should have looked it up, changed the music, took the beginnings of that theme and turned it into what became a great standard called Smile. Well, David, years later, was my guest at a Hollywood Bowl concert where I was performing with the Boston Pops. I was singing his song, Laura, and the orchestra played instrumentally the theme for Modern Times, Smile. My father was seated next to David Raksin in a box at the Bowl, and when the orchestra started to play, turned to David and said, did you know that Charlie Chaplin wrote that? And David looked at my father and said, I wrote that. So that's as close as he ever came to taking credit for writing that thing. And I do believe it was a collaboration. But without David Raksin, we might never have had the song Smile. So David was considered to be the finest of the Hollywood film composers in his time. And of course, there were many other extraordinary composers, such as Max Steiner and Franz Waxman, Eric Wolfgang Korngold. And I mean, you can go down the list of the major writers that were geniuses that happened to create for the medium of motion pictures. But David had something special because he was one of the most learned and educated people whom I ever knew. He knew music on a level that very few did. He not only understood it technically, but the history. And he was fascinated with antique musical instruments and would go all around the world when he had a vacation or a break, and would go to museums to seek out and discover these obsolete antiphonal instruments that were housed here and there. So he had an intellectual capacity that was quite extraordinary. I was very fascinated when once I was talking to David about inspiration, and he told me that he didn't believe that music came from a divine place, because I think it does. He said it was perspiration and work, and the result of the work is that you would get the ideas and you would work it out. Well, that's pretty amazing to me. Stephen Sondheim said that his single favorite piece of film music is the theme that David composed for a movie called The Bad and the Beautiful, which was a 1952 MGM drama that was directed by Vincent Minnelli and produced by John Houseman. It starred Kirk Douglas and Lana Turner, and it is a film noir theme, and I'd like to play it for you. The Bad and the Beautiful. Bad and the Beautiful. A couple of funny notes in there. I mean, I played a couple of funny notes, but I hope David will forgive me. It's not easy to play, but it's typical Raksin because it's majestic, it has beautiful melody, it's jazzy, and it was a perfect expression musically of the dramatic nature of that film. Later, Dory Previn wrote a lyric for it, which I recorded. David came to the session and was very happy about the song being recorded, because it's one of those things that has a multi-octave range and it's very, very hard to sing, which is why it's rarely done. There was another theme that he wrote for a movie called 2 Weeks in Another Town, which was also directed by Minnelli and produced by John Houseman, and is sort of the emotional sequel to The Bad and the Beautiful, and also starred Kirk Douglas. This theme is pretty obscure, but it's one of my favorites, and I played it for David at his 90th birthday celebration. 2 Weeks in Another Town. Let's see if I can do this without making mistakes. Farewell is a song that could have a beautiful lyric. 2 weeks in another town. Da, 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 da. I love this chord. I just love it. So, in the 1940s, David went back to Broadway as a composer. He wrote the music for a musical that was called If the Shoe Fits, which was a musicalization of Cinderella. The lyrics were by June Carroll. The producer was Leonard Sillman. Leonard Sillman was best known as producing the New Faces shows. He produced the New Faces reviews starting in the 1930s, I think 1934, and the last one I think was 1968. The most famous New Faces review was 1952 because it produced so many stars, including Ronnie Graham, Carol Lawrence, Eartha Kitt, Paul Lynde, who am I leaving out? Robert Clary, who later became known from his recurring role on Hogan's Heroes. Leonard Sillman's sister was June Carroll, and June Carroll was a very talented lyricist. So David is collaborating with June on If the Shoe Fits, and the show was a disaster. It unfortunately did not last very long, but there were some beautiful songs that came from it. David came to call the show If the Foo. I don't want to use that last word in case there's someone underage watching this, but June Carroll continued to write songs for Broadway through the decades, particularly collaborating with her brother Leonard Sillman when he produced shows. So during New Faces of 1952, Paul Lynde was not happy with the songs that he had to perform in the show. And he went to Leonard Sillman and said, "Leonard, those songs I'm singing, who wrote them?" Leonard said, "My sister." Paul said, "They're wonderful." Well, here is a song that David Raksin and June Sillman Carroll wrote for the score of If the Shoe Fits. The plot is just the same in every fantasy. The lovers meet and fall in love and then live happily. But now the story's changed, for something's gone awry. Now my forever after has passed me by. This is the end of the story that started so well. This is the scene where the lovers have nothing more to tell. No happy ending here as you supposed. So dry my tears, my friend, for now the book is closed. And this is the end of the story. So farewell, my love. No happy ending here as you suppose. So dry your tears, my friend, for now the book is closed. And this is the end of the story. So farewell, my love. Nice song, isn't it? I wish I had the sheet music cover to show you. It's a very beautiful, sort of dark pink, gorgeous thing. So, getting back to David's pièce de résistance. Laura. So, David has given me the assignment to write the score for a movie to be directed by Otto Preminger called Laura. Now, there's a scene in the film that Daryl Zanuck wanted to cut because it involved Dana Andrews as a detective wandering around a place trying to find clues about what happened to Laura, who has disappeared, and there's a beautiful oil painting of her, and as he wanders around, it's very melancholy, and he's very much in his brain. It's all, contemplative. And Daryl Zanuck wanted to cut the scene because he thought it was sort of like a stage wait. But David, who was very courageous in speaking up to Daryl Zanuck, who was the head of 20th Century Fox and was an autonomous tyrant, could have easily fired him, but David was a guy who spoke his mind. So Zanuck said, I'm going to cut the scene, because they had watched a rough cut of this movie. And David said, I think that's a mistake. And Zanuck said, who are you? That kind of thing. And David said, if you write the score, the right kind of music for this, if I write the right kind of music, it will give you an emotional sense of what he's feeling and thinking, and could be wonderful. Zanuck said, I'm still going to cut it. But David insisted. And so Zanuck said, okay, well, let's see what you can do. In the meantime, Otto Preminger wanted to use Gershwin's Summertime as the leitmotif of the film, and they couldn't get the rights. And then he wanted to use Duke Ellington's Sophisticated Lady. And David objected to that, not only because he was writing original music for the film, but also because he felt that Sophisticated Lady was a known song that had a lot of baggage connected to it. So anyway, Preminger said, well, do you think you can do better than Gershwin and Ellington? It was a Friday, and he said, I'll give you till Monday to come up with a theme. And if you can't come up with it, we're sticking with Sophisticated Lady. So David had the weight or the burden of having come up with a piece of music over the weekend that had to be accepted for this film by these people that he was worried about being able to please. And the pressures were getting to him because he worked all through the weekend writing tune after tune, and none of those tunes pleased him. He didn't think that any of them were any good. Well, he had sitting on his piano a letter he had received from his wife, who was appearing in a musical in New York on Broadway. He had been puzzling over the meaning of that letter, trying to figure out what the heck she was saying, because it was kind of like haiku. He couldn't quite figure out what she was trying to tell him. And then he reread the letter while he was sitting at the piano, and he realized that she was telling him that their marriage was over. At that point, he literally went, the theme music came to him. Literally, that tune came to him, and it was almost fully formed. And he presented it to the studio the following Monday. He was devastated at the breakup of his marriage because he loved his wife, even though they had been apart. But they accepted the tune. The tune went into the film, and it's used all through the movie in many different ways. It's used majestically as I played it, then it's used in a nightclub scene where you hear a dance band playing it, it's heard on a jukebox. The thing is all through the film, and it works beautifully. Well, after the movie came out, 20th Century Fox Studios was inundated with letters from people asking about that piece of music. What is that theme? Well, there were so many letters that David said he stopped counting after 1,000. There were letter after letter asking where they could buy the music. What was it? So the publishing branch of 20th Century Fox Studios thought, well, let's turn this into a popular song. David said he wanted Oscar Hammerstein to write the lyric. Well, Hammerstein very much wanted to write the lyric, but he had his own publishing company, and 20th Century Fox would not share the publishing with him, so that was over and done with. That was unfortunate, but didn't happen. Then Abe Ullman, who was the head of publishing, said, I've got the guy. And he suggested Irving Caesar. Irving Caesar wrote the lyrics to Swanee, how I love you, how I love you, my dear old Swanee. He also wrote Picture You Upon My Knee, T for two and two for tea. All big hits in the teens and 20s. Irving Caesar wrote a lyric. Unfortunately, he did not write a lyric called Laura. David wrote the theme. So it would be a Laura. That was one thing that he imbued into that tune. Well, the lyric that Irving wrote that David hated was, two dreams lie awake in my secret heart. Two dreams, tell me which shall it be? Well, when David heard the lyric, he said to the publisher, I hate those words. And Abe Ullman said the absurd lines, who are you to not like that lyric? He said, who am I? I'm the composer. And Abe Ullman said, well, then who would you like to write the lyric? And David said, I'd like Johnny Mercer. Well, they got Johnny Mercer. When David met Johnny Mercer, Mercer immediately started needling him because David had been working on the movie The Harvey Girls, was orchestrating the number on the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. And Johnny said, I heard you've made up some dirty lyrics to Atchison, Topeka. And so David sheepishly told him the lyrics that he had written, and Johnny got a kick out of that. But then he got to work, and he took David's tune, and he wrote a lyric for it. And the thing that is amazing about the lyric is that Johnny Mercer had never seen the film Laura at that point, yet the lyric absolutely describes what is going on in the film and what the theme of the movie is. So he sensed that whole thing through David's music. However, there was one more problem that had to be solved with Johnny Mercer writing a lyric, and that is that the original tune of Laura, as it was used in the film, had, again, an octave range or a musical range that would make it very, very hard for someone to sing, because the original tune went. So David had to rewrite it. So the turnaround after the bridge would go back to the same range, so it was singable. So with that corrected and revamped melody turned into a 32-bar form, that's how Johnny Mercer lyricized it. Well, the next thing was trying to get somebody to record the song. It was rejected by Bing Crosby, who was the #1 recording star at that time, because he said it was too odd of a melody. But it was eventually recorded lyrically by Woody Herman. And after Woody Herman recorded it, the floodgates opened, and Laura eventually received hundreds and hundreds of recordings. So before I sing it for you, I'd like to show you one thing. David Raksin, in addition to being an extraordinary film composer, was also a master orchestrator. He was one of the great arrangers of the 20th century in that he knew everything about any kind of orchestra and was a masterful man who could choose different tone qualities and all of the different sonorities that would make his orchestrations very special. And so in the early 1990s, I asked David if he would do a symphonic setting for me of Laura so I could sing it. So the only time that David Raksin ever did a full symphonic orchestration for a singer of his composition Laura was for me. So this is one of my prized possessions. David presented the score to me, and that's a photocopy inside of what he conducted from when we premiered it with the San Francisco Symphony. This is his orchestral sketch. It's his manuscript in his hand, his pencil manuscript. And then this is his full orchestral score in his hand, in ink and in pencil, which is on onion skin paper so it could be reproduced. And those post-its are his notes to the copyist, so it would be copied properly for all the instruments in the orchestra. So this is something that I treasure. I recorded this arrangement with the Israel Philharmonic a number of years ago, and I always think of my friend David when I sing it. You know the feeling of something half remembered, of something that never happened, yet you recall it well. You know the feeling of recognizing someone that you've never met, as far as you can tell. Well, Laura is the face in the misty light. Footsteps that you hear down the hall. The laugh that floats on a summer night, and you can never recall. And you see Laura on the train